Hey everyone, we're back. I'm Minister James Moss, and no, I'm not on caffeine. I'm not no drugs either. Okay, all right. No, we're here with continuing education. We're in the book of Acts. All right, so we're in chapter 21. We're about to go over into chapter 22. This is an overlapping point. So we're going to start at verse 37 in chapter 1 and go all the way to verse 23 in chapter 22. This is called Paul Speaks to the Crowd. Okay, all right. So if you notice, they jumped on Paul. They beat him. They was trying to kill him. The Roman soldiers came and pretty much rescued him by arresting him. They even had to pick him up and run with him because the crowd was so vicious and so bent on killing him. But we're going to get into it. All right. So Paul's defense before the Jewish mob in the temple courts is a textbook example of how to communicate to a hostile audience. He disarmed the Roman commander by speaking to him in Greek. Then he established common ground with the Jews gathered below him by speaking to them in their own language. Presenting his credentials as a devout Jew trained under the highly respected Rabbi Gamaliel, Paul then described his unlikely encounter with the risen Christ on the Damascus road. The crowd listened attentively until Paul mentioned Gentiles. At that word, the mob erupted in anger. Although Paul knew his statement would cause controversy, he refused to dilute the truth. All right. So we're going to go. All right. So starting verse 37. And as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, May I speak unto thee? Who said, Canst thou speak Greek? Art not thou that Egyptian which before these days madest an uproar and leddest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? But Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make unto you. And when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence. And he said, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day. And I persecuted this way unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. As also the high priest doth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound unto Jerusalem for to be punished. And it came to pass that as I made my journey and was come nigh unto Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me. And I fell unto the ground and heard a voice saying unto me, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And I answered, Who art thou, O Lord? And he said unto me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. And they that were with me saw indeed the light, and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said unto me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there it shall be told thee of all the things which are appointed for thee to do. And when I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came into Damascus. And one, Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews which dwelt there, came unto me and stood and said unto me, Brother Saul, receive thy sight. In the same hour I looked up upon him. And he said, The God of our fathers hath chosen thee, that thou shouldest know his will, and see that just one, and shouldest hear the voice of his mouth. For thou shalt be his witness unto all men of what thou hast seen and heard. And now why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized, and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. And it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance. and saw him, saying unto me, Make haste and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. And I said, Lord, they know that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on thee. And when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by and consenting unto his death, and kept the raiment of them that slew him. And he said unto me, Depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. And they gave him audience unto his words, and then lifted up their voices and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. And as they cried out, and cast off their robes, and threw dust in the air, into the air. Wow. Okay, so here we go. Verses 37, 38. By speaking in Greek, Paul showed that he was a cultured, educated man and not just a common rebel starting riots in the streets. The language grabbed the commander's attention and gave Paul protection and the opportunity to give his defense. The historian Josephus wrote of an Egyptian who had led a revolt of thousands of Jews in Jerusalem in AD 54. This was probably about 3 years prior to now, where we are in Scripture. This self-proclaimed prophet had convinced his fanatical followers to accompany him to the nearby Mount of Olives. He said that at his word, the walls of Jerusalem would collapse, and this miraculous event would precipitate the destruction of the Roman Empire. Governor Felix had dispatched troops to deal with this insurrection. Hundreds of Jews were either killed or captured, and the Egyptian ringleader of this sect had disappeared into the desert. Lysias apparently assumed that Paul was this rebel returning to make more trouble. Verses 39 and 40. All these events took place outside the fortress of Antonia, the Roman garrison that adjoined the temple area on the northwest side. From the headquarters of Claudius Lysias, 2 flights of stairs led down into the outer court of the temple. The staircase would prove to be an excellent platform from which Paul could talk to these people. The commander agreed to Paul's request. The text does not tell us why. Perhaps he was convinced that Paul was not some insurrectionist or rabble-rouser. He was a Jew and a proper citizen. The commander may have thought that Paul could explain to the crowd what had happened, and hopefully they would disperse peacefully. So he agreed to let Paul speak. Paul looked out on an enraged mob, and his heart broke. He ached for his people to understand the truth about Christ. He had been just like them, spiritually blind, and he wanted his Jewish brothers to experience this same salvation. When Paul began speaking to the assembled crowd, he addressed them in their own language, Aramaic, the common language among Palestinian Jews. He spoke in Aramaic not only to communicate in the language of his listeners, but also to show that he was a devout Jew and had respect for the Jewish laws and customs. Chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. With this courteous salutation, Paul began the first of 5 defenses recorded by Luke in the book of Acts. He commanded the mob's attention by speaking Aramaic, their own language, because many Jews of the dispersion could not speak Greek or Hebrew. The mob would have assumed that Paul, an outsider, could speak only Greek. Paul's ability to speak Aramaic gave his Jewish credentials even more weight and helped him win a hearing. Verse 3, Paul began his defense with a brief personal history. The statement, I am a Jew, declares Paul's brotherhood with the crowd. Though born in Tarsus, Paul had been educated in Jerusalem. Not only that, but under Gamaliel, the most honored rabbi of that time. Gamaliel was well known and respected as an expert on religious law and as a voice for moderation. At Gamaliel's feet, Paul had learned to follow our Jewish laws and customs very carefully. The Pharisees were legendary for their rigorous keeping of the most minute details of the law. This statement by Paul was intended to refute the allegation in 21 and 28 that he had been telling everyone to disobey the Jewish laws. In saying he was zealous to honor God in everything, Paul was alluding to his former prominent role in the persecution of Christians. He recognized the sincere motives behind their desire to kill him, and that a few years earlier, he had shared that same well-meaning but misguided passion. Verses 4 and 5. Having commended his Jewish audience for their zeal, Paul described how his passion for Judaism and against Christianity had been even more intense. Beyond merely accosting Christians on the temple grounds, Paul had sought their death. Furthermore, he had been authorized to bring Christians all the way from Damascus back to Jerusalem in chains to be punished. These were widely known, indisputable facts, making Paul's testimony extremely powerful. Paul's conversion is recorded in chapter 9. Here, Paul told the story himself, making it clear that his conversion was not an issue of defection, but a matter of divine intervention. Paul had been about his business, intent on his mission, and apparently very content and settled in his pro-Jewish, anti-Christian state of mind. Suddenly, Jesus himself intervened and spoke to Paul. Without referring to a single Old Testament prophecy or launching into a theological discourse, Paul used his personal experience to press the points that Jesus was both alive and glorified. And, my nose gets ticklish when I'm reading. I don't know why. So if you see me reach up and scratch or whatever, that's because it's tickling to the point that it's bugging me. Okay. All right. So verses 10 through 13. Blinded, confused, shocked, scared, Paul's mind must have been reeling as he lay in the dust. He had responded with a humble question. What shall I do, Lord? Paul related to his audience the physical effects of this divine revelation. He had been unable to see and had to be led into Damascus by others. There, Jesus told him that he would receive further instructions. To give further credence to his testimony before such a zealous Jewish mob, Paul described the role Ananias had played in his conversion, mentioning Ananias' stellar reputation among the Jews of Damascus. Verses 14 through 16, Paul reported that he had heard through the lips of this respected devout Jew his unexpected, unsought commission. Ananias had made it clear that the supernatural events being experienced by Paul were the sovereign work of none other than the God of our ancestors. In jealously opposing Jesus and his followers, zealously opposing Jesus and his followers, Paul had assumed that he had been serving and honoring the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses. Through the announcement of Ananias, he had learned the truth. The God of the Hebrews, far from leading Paul to fight Christianity, was selecting him to become the leading spokesman for this new faith. Paul would take his message everywhere. So Paul was baptized right then, a powerful outward sign of Paul's inward cleansing from sin and his embracing of the truth. Verses 17 and 18, Paul continued to answer the mob's accusations. He stated, in effect, that he was not anti-temple, and by praying and worshiping there, he demonstrated his continued respect for the temple, even as a follower of Jesus. While he was praying in the temple, Paul received a heavenly vision. The Greek word for trance is ecstasy. It sounds like ecstasy, or ecstasy. The same root used to describe Peter's dreamlike encounter on the rooftop in Joppa. In this vision, Jesus appeared and warned Paul to promptly leave Jerusalem because the Jews would not accept his testimony. In chapter 9, verses 29 through 30, Luke reported that Paul departed Jerusalem upon the advice of his Christian brothers. This apparent discrepancy is easily resolved by viewing Paul as led by both human counsel and divine revelation. The advice from worried believers probably came first, later being confirmed by that other, stronger, more irresistible voice. Verses 19 and 20. Never one to run from controversy or trouble, Paul protested mildly. He obviously felt convinced that his conversion from a notorious persecutor of Christians into an ardent evangelist for the way would impress his Jewish accusers. Surely they would marvel at the change in his life. He could not and would not have done such a complete about-face without compelling reasons. Perhaps implicit in Paul's rejoinder was the thought that preaching to such a volatile audience might in some way make up for the damage he had done, or make up for the damage he had done to the church, especially assisting in and approving the killing of Stephen. So, and I want to pause real quick right there, because out of all the people that Paul persecuted in the church, Stephen stands out the most in his mind, as we see in Scripture. Okay, and if you ever take time to really think about it, wonder about, Stephen must have had a big impact on people, period. But for Paul to remember, and like it says here, perhaps implicit in Paul's rejoinder was the thought that preaching to such a volatile audience might in some way make up for the damage he had done to the church, especially assisting in and approving the killing of Stephen. For him to mention that was something that just, probably haunted him, stayed on him. That probably might, come to think about it, that might have been his thorn in the side. When Paul talks about the thorn in the side, this may be that very thorn. All right, let's keep going. Chapter 21, Paul's appeal to the Lord was unsuccessful. For Paul's own safety and for the fulfillment of God's eternal plan, Paul needed to leave Jerusalem. A plot on his life was in the works. Specifically, the Lord was commissioning Paul to take the message of salvation to the Gentiles. Verses 22 and 23. These people had listened intently to Paul, but the word Gentiles brought out all their anger and exposed their pride. They were supposed to be a light to the Gentiles, telling them about the one true God. But they had renounced that mission by becoming separatist and exclusive. Did the Jews hate the Gentiles? No. Continual efforts were made by the Jews to try to convert the Gentiles. The implications of Paul's testimony and Christian gospel were clear, however. He was suggesting that the Gentiles could be saved and made right with God without first subscribing to the law and submitting to Jewish circumcision. In effect, Paul was claiming divine approval for the idea that Jews and Gentiles could have equal standing before God. This message collided head-on with the blindness, pride, and prejudice of the Jews. The results were explosive, as we see. Just go back and study these scriptures, ponder on it, ask God for revelation, and then ask God for application. By all means, thank you so much for contributing to this ministry however you do, by referring us to someone or sharing the information one way or another. Thank you so much. And I thank God for you. God bless you. God keep you. And remember, always keep studying.